So these three facts are pretty firmly established, and the only question is then how do you best explain them? I think that the answer of both the Hebrew Bible and the New Testament can be put into one word.
What proof is there that Jesus was who he said he was? What proof is there that Jesus was actually God himself? We're about to watch a clip between Ben Shapiro and William Lane Craig. And this is one of the only times that I've seen Ben Shapiro actually not have an answer to something. He's left speechless. But there's some good discussion that takes place here. And Christians have believed something for so long, sometimes they actually forget why they believe it. So this could be interesting whether you're coming from a perspective of not believing, not too sure, or even if you are a Christian. Let's dive in.
What is the proof that Jesus was who he says he is in the Gospels?
Well, first we need to establish who he thought he was. When you look at the religio-historical context of the life and ministry of Jesus, I think you can show that among the historically authentic words of Jesus were claims that he thought he was the Jewish Messiah, that he believed himself to be the Son of God in a unique sense that set him apart from Jewish kings and prophets, and finally, that he thought that he was the Son of Man predicted by the prophet Daniel, to whom God would give all dominion, power, and authority. So he had this radical self-understanding of being Messiah, Son of God, and the Son of Man. And at the trial scene before the Sanhedrin in Mark 15, all three of these titles come to a head when the high priest asks him, "Are you the Messiah, the Son of the Blessed One, that is the Son of God?" And Jesus says, "I am." And then virtually quoting from Daniel, "And you will see the Son of Man coming on the clouds of heaven and seated at the right hand of the power." And at that point, the high priest rips his robes and says, "You have heard the blasphemy. What more witnesses do we need?" And Mark says they all condemned him as worthy of death.
There are parts in the Gospels where Jesus is discreet and a bit vague about his identity. But if you look at it as a whole picture, there's a reason why he's secretive and a reason why, his time hasn't come yet. Also, I think the Gospel writers want to take you on a journey. I think and the disciples are on their own journey of discovery of who Jesus is throughout the Gospels. But I think in any Gospel, if you have a look at the big picture, there are some really bold, clear statements of who Jesus believed he was. And this is a great point that William Lane Craig makes, because it's quite clear how the Pharisees at the time interpreted what Jesus was saying. And if Jesus wasn't saying that, at that point he could have said, "Oh, no, I'm not saying that. What I mean by that is that he knew exactly what he was saying. He tackled it head on, and that's why he went to the cross, and that's why he stayed on the cross. That's why he went there willingly."
So when it comes to the resurrection, why is resurrection proof of divinity? So Lazarus is resurrected.
That was why I wanted to emphasize the religio-historical context before we talked about the resurrection. A miracle taken in isolation is inherently ambiguous. The proper interpretation of a miracle is going to be given by the religio-historical context in which it occurs. And the resurrection of Jesus is not just the resurrection of any old body. It's the resurrection of the man who claimed to be Messiah, Son of God, and Son of Man, and who was crucified for those allegedly blasphemous claims. If God has raised this man from the dead, then he has, I think, unequivocally and publicly vindicated those allegedly blasphemous claims.
So one of the counterclaims to some of this is that the Gospels are written significantly after Jesus lives. Even the earliest Gospel is written, 70 CE? Somewhere 40 years after Jesus is crucified. So what's to say, that like most historical events, there is some play in the joints here. So that this would be the historical argument against the exact veracity of the gospel revelation.
What I would argue is that underlying the inference to the resurrection of Jesus are three great independently established facts. And these facts would be that after his crucifixion and burial by a member of the Sanhedrin named Joseph of Arimathea, that Jesus' tomb was discovered empty on the first day of the week by a group of his female followers. Secondly would be that various individuals and groups of people then witnessed appearances of Jesus alive. And finally, number three would be that the original disciples suddenly and sincerely came to believe that God had raised Jesus from the dead, despite having every predisposition to the contrary.
That last point especially, I think, is a poignant one, because what's being argued there is that the disciples are actually going against their own predisposition. They are Jewish people who also have a predisposition in what the Jewish people of the time believed about the Messiah. And so, if they're claiming now that this Jesus has risen from the dead, it flies in the face of everything that they would have themselves believed.
The fact of the discovery of the empty tomb is attested by at least 6 independent sources in the New Testament, some of which are extraordinarily early. No scholar denies that individuals and groups saw postmortem appearances of Jesus. The only question is whether you should or could dismiss them as hallucinatory. And again, nobody denies that the original disciples suddenly and sincerely came to believe that God had raised Jesus from the dead. So these 3 facts are pretty firmly established, and the only question is then how do you best explain them?
The disciples and the followers of Jesus to have said this wouldn't have come as a benefit to them. This would have led to mockery, but even more so to persecution, as we will come to see, as you come to see in the New Testament. So it's to no benefit to be shouting from the rooftops that you've seen this Jesus, unless you really have.
So let's talk for a second about sort of the necessity for Judeo-Christian revelation, because, and here I'm going to merge the two in terms of the idea of God personally speaking to people and giving them the morality of the Old Testament, which largely is reflected in the New Testament. And the New Testament is part of the Old Testament, according to Christians anyway. It reflects the chief morality of the Old Testament. It doesn't supplant it entirely. The Old Testament doesn't become a nothing just because the New Testament comes around. So that's why I'm now moving back toward the kind of theological question, which is, what's the purpose of the revelation? Meaning, would it be sufficient to work within the framework of the first half of our conversation with regard to sort of rational pushes not toward revelation and the presence of God in human form in Christianity, or the presence of God on top of a mountain in Judaism? Would a God of reason alone be sufficient? Or do you need to have, for what purpose do you need to have a God who is speaking directly to people at Sinai or speaking through Jesus in Christianity?
I think that the answer of both the Hebrew Bible and the New Testament can be put into one word: atonement. What is needed is atonement for sin.
Well, that's a pretty neat way to put it. I've never heard anyone simplify the Old Testament and New Testament as the one theme that, if you like, crosses over the two is atonement. When William Lane Craig here says atonement, obviously Ben Shapiro knows what he means from a Jewish perspective. But for those that don't know, what he means by atonement is the pardoning of sin. Sin gets in the way of us and God, and that reconciliation is needed. And that something or someone is needed to reconcile that between God. A lot of people would argue, well, why do you need that? Why do we need to reconcile with God? Well, actually, I just think God is someone who just loves everyone regardless. Yes, there is the belief that love is there. I love my child, but I know that when he does something really bad, when he's done something really rude and he's been really overstepped the line, it's just not right. It never feels right to just go, oh, that's okay, son, let's carry on. There needs to be some sort of consequence to say, actually, that was wrong. You need to make up for that. And so often there'll be a punishment. It doesn't mean I don't love my son, but there'll be a punishment to say, you overstepped the mark. That was really bad behavior. You've now lost your Nintendo Switch for an afternoon, or you're now going to bed early to atone for the thing that you've done wrong. It's not that God doesn't love us. Someone is needed to make up for the difference. In the Jewish belief, of course, you atone for your sins through the sacrifices at the temple. But in Christianity, there's the ultimate atonement, a final atonement.
And in the Levitical sacrifices, in the tabernacle and later in the temple, you had a sacrificial system whereby atonement was made for sin through the sacrifice of various animals. And Jesus himself and the authors of the New Testament think of Jesus as being the ultimate sacrificial offering to God to make atonement once and for all for the sins of mankind, so that in his sacrificial death on the cross, he fulfills all of these Jewish antecedents or foreshadowing of a decisive atonement for sin that will reconcile us to God and bring forgiveness and pardon and cleansing.
So you've debated a bevy of atheists and agnostics on a variety of topics. Which was the debate that you felt was most challenging for you?
Did you notice that? That wasn't clipped up. I haven't edited it. When given an answer which isn't just the evidence, he previously had been given some good evidence to the fact that Jesus has risen again. But this is an answer from a theological point of view. Why theologically is Jesus even necessary? That the Old Testament foreshadows that there will be an atonement made. So there you go. Ben Shapiro is confronted with some evidence for the resurrection of Jesus, but also some evidence from a theological point of view of why Jesus would even be the one who fulfills anything that the Jewish people believe. And he doesn't really have a response. I don't know if there's a bigger reason to that, but it is interesting to see that Ben Shapiro, who usually has an answer for almost anything, is there presented with something and doesn't actually have anything to rebuttal it with, anything concrete. I hope that you enjoyed this. You've been watching Mr. Priest. Please comment, like, subscribe, and I'll be seeing you very soon with some new content. God bless you.